The boy walked into the compound without fear. 7 years old, silent, eyes steady as a judge. The guards looked at each other, because they recognized something in that face, something that made their hands freeze before they could stop him. Inside, the most powerful man in Seoul sat at the head of a table surrounded by men who feared him. He had dissolved a marriage like a signature on a contract, had erased a woman's name from his world as if she had never existed. He had decided, 7 years ago, that there would be no heir from that union. But blood does not negotiate. Blood does not obey orders. Blood arrives. And now she was standing at his gate, the woman he had thrown away, not with tears, not with pleas, but with the quiet of someone who has already won. So tell me, when a man destroys what he refuses to understand, what happens when it grows up and comes back for what is his? Halmoni Cha used to say that the Ryu family was not built on land or money. It was built on a rule older than any law, that the bloodline must remain unbroken, undiluted, and untouched by what the elders called foreign roots. Ryu Seok had absorbed this truth before he could read. His father had whispered it over him as a child. His grandfather had died for it. The clan's entire identity rested on one belief, that their blood carried a particular kind of strength, and that strength could only be passed through approved veins. So when Ryu Seok, at 32, already commanding 3 districts and feared by men twice his age, brought home a woman named Zola, the silence at the dinner table spoke louder than any objection. She was graceful, educated. She had met him in a world where he was allowed to be something other than a boss. She had looked at him without fear, and that had undone him in ways he didn't have language for. He married her privately, quickly, before his council could form the words to stop him. But councils do not stay quiet. Within months, the elders gathered. The message was delivered through his most trusted lieutenant, not his father, which told Ryu Seok everything about how serious they considered the matter. She cannot stay, not as a wife, not in this house, not carrying this name. Ryu Seok had sat with the ultimatum for 3 days. On the 4th day, he called Zola into his office. He did not look at her when he spoke. He placed an envelope on the desk, money, documents, a one-way arrangement, and said only this: "The marriage is over. You will be taken care of. You will not contact this family again." Zola had stared at him for a long time. She did not cry. She did not plead. She picked up the envelope, turned toward the door, and stopped. For one breath, just one, she placed her hand over her stomach. Then she walked out. Ryu Seok did not see it. Or perhaps he chose not to. That was the difference between a man and a leader. And that day, Ryu Seok chose to be only a leader. The clan was satisfied. The council praised his discipline. His father clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Now you are ready." And the compound moved on, as power always does, without looking at what it had left behind. The man who cuts the root of the tree to preserve the branch will one day sit in shade that no longer belongs to him. 7 years of silence. Ryu Seok had remarried within the first 2. A woman selected by the council, composed Korean, perfectly suited to the image of a dynasty wife. The wedding was large. The ceremony was precise. The elders nodded with satisfaction. But the years passed. No child came. Doctors were consulted in private. Results were kept quieter still. The diagnosis was never spoken aloud in the compound, but everyone who needed to know, knew. The bloodline had gone still. Rivals began to murmur. Other families began to position. What is a dynasty without an heir? What is a throne without a child to inherit it? Ryu Seok felt the pressure tighten around him like a slow closing fist. He was still feared, still ruthless, still obeyed. But fear without succession is only borrowed time, and everyone in his world understood that. It was on a Tuesday, ordinary, overcast, when the call came to his head of security. A woman was at the east gate. She had not been announced. She had not been invited. She had no appointment and no escort. But she had given a name that made the guard pause before reaching for the phone. Zola. When the report reached Ryu Seok, he went still. He did not speak for almost a full minute. "Send her away," he said finally. His head of security hesitated, something he never did. "Sir, she didn't come alone." Another pause. "There is a child with her." The room shifted without moving. Something invisible changed pressure. The way the air changes before a storm arrives, not with wind, but with silence. Ryu Seok stood and walked to the window that overlooked the outer courtyard. He looked down. Zola stood at the gate, older now, composed in a way that was almost architectural, like someone who had rebuilt themselves from the foundation up. She wore no expression that could be read as desperation. And beside her, holding her hand with the easy calm of a child who had been told exactly where he was going and why, was a boy. 7 years old, jaw set like carved stone, eyes that, even from that distance, looked back at Ryu Seok with a steadiness that no 7-year-old should possess. Unless he had been prepared. Unless someone had told him, "You will go there, and you will not flinch." Ryu Seok's second wife appeared in the doorway behind him. She looked at his face, not at the courtyard, and she understood immediately. She left the room without a word. Ryu Seok turned to his lieutenant. "Bring them inside. The gate you close against the rain cannot be locked against the flood that follows it." They brought Zola and the boy to a receiving room, neutral, formal, nothing that could be interpreted as welcome. Ryu Seok entered alone. No counsel, no lieutenants, no witnesses. He looked at Zola first. She let him. Then he looked at the boy, and something happened in his chest that he had no name for, because he had spent 7 years ensuring he would never need one. The boy looked back without blinking. "His name is Day," Zola said. Her voice had not changed, still low, still precise. "Dai Ryu, I gave him your name, not as a gift, as a record." Ryu Seok's jaw tightened. "You were asked never to contact—" "I honored that," she interrupted. Calm, surgical. "For 7 years, I honored it. You had your dynasty. I had my silence. That was the arrangement." She reached into the bag she carried and placed a folder on the table between them. "That is no longer the arrangement." He did not touch the folder. "Inside," she continued, "is every document. His birth record, the paternity results, done independently through a third party your own medical team would recognize. His school records, his health history." She paused. "And a letter from Helmoni Cha." That landed differently. Ryu Seok's eyes moved for the first time. Helmoni Cha, his own grandmother, the eldest surviving Ryu, the woman whose word had carried more authority in the compound than any council, had been ill for over a year, kept in the East Wing, seen by almost no one. "She knows," he said quietly. "She has known since the beginning," Zola said. "She contacted me 6 months after you sent me away. She was the one who told me to wait, to raise him well, to come back only when the time was right." Zola held his gaze. She decided the time is now. The boy, Day, had not moved from beside his mother. He had not looked around the room with curiosity. He had not fidgeted. He simply stood, as if he had been standing in that exact place his entire life, waiting to be acknowledged. Ryu Seok crouched down slowly until he was at eye level with his son. He studied the boy's face up close, the line of his brow, the shape of his mouth, and what he found there was not a stranger. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. Day considered the question with the seriousness of someone much older. "Yes," the boy said. "My mother told me you didn't know about me." He paused. "She said she would let you decide what kind of man you wanted to be now." Ryu Seok said nothing. Zola's voice came from above him, quiet and final. "I did not come back for you, Seok. I came back for him. Because he deserves to know what he is. Because your bloodline, the one your council was so determined to protect, is standing in this room. And they don't even know it yet." She let that settle. "The question," she said, "is whether you will tell them, or whether you will send us away again." and live the rest of your life watching your dynasty dissolve, knowing exactly what you buried. Ryu Seok remained crouched for a long moment. Then he stood. He turned to the door and called his lieutenant's name. "Prepare a room," he said. "They stay tonight." It was not forgiveness, it was not love. It was the moment a man realizes that what he discarded did not disappear. It simply waited. The heir who grows in exile does not return as a child. He returns as a reckoning. The news moved through the compound the way fire moves through dry grass. Fast, low, and impossible to stop once it had started. By morning, 3 council elders had requested an emergency meeting. By afternoon, Ryu Seok's second wife had left the East Wing with 2 packed bags, and the quiet dignity of a woman who had always understood her role was temporary. She had simply hoped it would not end like this. By evening, the compound was divided. There were those who looked at day and saw the Ryu jawline, the Ryu stillness, the unmistakable weight of a boy who carried something ancient in his posture, and they said nothing because they understood. And there were those who looked at Day and saw only what he was not purely Korean, not what the elders had planned, not the heir the council had approved. Those were the dangerous ones. The first threat came on the second night. Not violence, not yet. A message. Delivered to Ryu Seok's head of security through an intermediary connected to the Bayek family, rivals who had been circling the Ryu territory for years, waiting for exactly this kind of fracture. The message was simple. Remove the child, or we will do it for you. Ryu Seok read it once, folded it, placed it in his jacket pocket. Then he walked to the room where Day had been sleeping, and stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the boy breathe. He had spent 7 years making decisions based on what his council wanted, what his rivals feared, what the bloodline demanded. He had been ruthless, effective, respected, and he had produced nothing. This child, the one he had unknowingly abandoned, the one who had grown up without him, the one who had walked into his compound with his mother's composure and his grandfather's eyes, was the only real thing Ryu Seok had ever created. He closed the door quietly and called his most trusted lieutenant. Double the guard on the east corridor. No one enters or exits without my personal clearance. He paused. And find out who delivered that message. Every hand it passed through. The lieutenant nodded and hesitated, which meant there was something else. The council is requesting a formal hearing, sir. They want the boy's legitimacy put to a vote. Ryu Seok turned slowly. A vote, he repeated. Yes, sir. The silence that followed was the kind that made experienced men take a step back. Tell the council, Ryu Seok said carefully, that the Ryu bloodline is not a democracy. He went to see Hail Moni Cha that same night. The old woman was propped against her pillows in the east wing, smaller than he remembered, but her eyes had lost none of their precision. She looked at him as he entered, the way she had always looked at him, like she was reading something written behind his face. You came, she said. You engineered this, he replied. Not anger, just fact. She smiled faintly. I preserved it. There is a difference. He sat beside her bed. For a moment, neither spoke. The council will fight it, he said. The council fights everything that threatens their comfort, she said. That is not the same as fighting for the family. She reached out and placed her aged hand over his. That boy has your blood and his mother's spine, she said quietly. That is not a weakness, Seok. That is the only kind of heir who survives what is coming. He looked at her. What is coming? He asked. She closed her eyes. Everything you have been delaying by refusing to look at it. The clan that fights its own heir to protect its pride has already chosen its grave. The council meeting lasted 4 hours. Ryu Seok sat at the head of the table and let them speak. He had always believed that a man who interrupts in a council room is a man who is afraid of what is being said. So he listened. To the objections, the traditions recited like weapons, the veiled threats wrapped in the language of concern for the family. When they finished, he spoke for 6 minutes. He presented the paternity documents. He acknowledged the irregularity of the situation with the clinical precision of a man who had run operations far more complicated than this. He outlined clearly what the Ryu succession looked like without Dae. Fractured, contested, vulnerable to every rival family waiting at the borders. Then he said the thing none of them expected. This is not a request for your approval. I am informing you of what has already been decided. The eldest council member, a man of 70 who had sat at that table since Ryu Seok's father's time, leaned forward. The boy's blood is mixed. The tradition, Ryu Seok interrupted for the first and only time, kept this seat empty for 7 years. He let that land. The tradition almost handed our territory to the Beck family while we congratulated ourselves on our purity. Silence. The boy is legitimate. He carries my name. He will be acknowledged. He looked at each face in the room. If any member of this council chooses to act against that decision, against the child, against his mother, or against this family's future, I will consider it an act of internal treason, and I will respond accordingly. No one spoke. The meeting ended, but the lesson had not yet been fully delivered. That afternoon, Ryu Seok came to find Dae in the garden. The boy was sitting alone, watching a line of ants cross the stone path with the focused patience of a scientist. He did not look up immediately when Ryu Seok approached. He waited until the man sat down beside him. Your mother says you like to observe things, Ryu Seok said. She says that's how you know what something really is, Dae replied, still watching the ants. Ryu Seok was quiet for a moment. I owe you an explanation, he said. Dae finally looked at him. His expression was not angry. It was simply attentive, as though he had been waiting for this conversation with the same patience he gave the ants. Your mother told you I didn't know about you, Ryu Seok continued. That is partly true. But the fuller truth is that I made choices that made it easy not to know. And that is not something I can undo.
If you're listening to this right now, it's because this story has already pulled you in a little. But what you're hearing here is just a part of it. The full version includes 30 complete stories, no cuts. No ads, just the audio flowing while you listen. The QR code is on your screen now, or the link is pinned in the queue.
I can only decide what I do from here. The boy considered this. My mother says that honor isn't about what you did before, Dae said slowly. It's about what you do when you find out you were wrong. Ryu Seok looked at his son, 7 years old. His mother's words, his grandfather's eyes. She's right, Ryu Seok said quietly. I know, said Dae, and went back to watching the ants. It was the most honest conversation Ryu Seok had in years, and it had come from a child he had almost discarded. That evening, he went to Zola. He did not offer grand words. He was not built for them. He stood in the doorway of the room she had been given and said only, You raised him well, better than I would have. Zola looked at him for a long moment. I know that too, she said. But he needed to hear it from you. Ryu Seok nodded once. What do you want from this? He asked. Not for him. For you. She thought about it genuinely, which told him she had not come with a rehearsed answer. I want him to be safe, she said finally. I want him to know both of what he is. Not half of one thing and half of another, but the whole of both. She paused. And I want this family to stop treating heritage like a weapon. He said nothing in response, but he didn't leave immediately either. He stood there a moment longer, not as a boss, not as a man defending a throne, but as someone sitting with the weight of what it costs to have been, for a long time, exactly the wrong kind of strong. A man who learns honor from his own child, has not lost his way. He has simply found it later than he deserved. Helmoni Cha died on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Dae arrived at the compound. She died the way she had lived, quietly, on her own terms, with no audience and no drama, in the East Wing she had inhabited for 40 years. The nurse who had been watching over her said that the old woman had been awake in the early hours, sitting up in bed without assistance, looking out the window at the garden below as if she were memorizing it. When the nurse returned 20 minutes later with warm tea, Helmoni Cha had her eyes closed and her hands folded over her blanket, with the peaceful precision of someone who had decided, simply, that she was finished. There was a belief among the older members of the Ryu family, passed down through generations, never written, never questioned, that the great elders of the clan did not die by accident. They died by appointment. They held on until something was resolved, until some wound was closed or some truth was delivered, and then they released themselves from the obligation of living. Helmoni Cha had held on for 3 weeks. She had waited for the boy. She had waited for him to arrive, to stand inside the compound walls, to breathe the same air as the men and women who carried the Ryu name. And only when she was certain that he was real, that he was there, that Ryu Seok had not sent them away again, did she allow herself to let go. Ryu Seok stood in the doorway of her room for a long time after they told him. He did not go in immediately. He stood in the corridor with his hand on the doorframe, looking at the still shape of the woman who had raised him with more precision and more honesty than either of his parents had managed. And he understood, with the kind of clarity that only loss can produce, that she had been the last person in his life who told him the truth without fear of what he would do with it. He went in alone. He sat beside her bed and took her hand, already cool, already returning to something simpler than a person. And he stayed there for almost an hour without speaking, because there was nothing left to say that she did not already know. He thought about the letter she had written to Zola. He thought about 6 years of correspondence conducted behind his back by the woman he trusted most in the world, and he did not feel betrayed. He felt, if he was willing to be honest with himself, something much closer to gratitude, because Helmoni Cha had done what he had been too afraid, too rigid, too proud to do. She had kept the thread intact. She had made sure the needle was still there when the time came to sew the wound closed. He kissed her forehead before he left the room. It was the most unguarded thing anyone in the compound had seen him do in years. The funeral brought the full clan together for the first time in over a decade. Not just the inner circle, not just the council and the lieutenants and the trusted few who moved through the compound on ordinary days. The full clan, blood relatives from 3 provinces, old alliances, men and women who carried the Ryu name or were bound to it by loyalty or by history, gathered in the formal courtyard and in the hall beyond, filling the space with a silence that was less like grief, and more like the collective breath of something very old coming to attention. Dae stood at the front. Ryu Seok had come to his room that morning with the formal clothes already pressed and ready, dark, precise, appropriate. He had helped the boy dress without speaking, moving carefully, as if the act of buttoning a collar and straightening a small jacket were instructions he was reading for the first time and did not want to get wrong. Dae had stood still for it, watching his father's face with that particular quality of attention that was entirely his own. Not a child's restless curiosity, but something older, something that observed and recorded and reserved judgment. When Ryu Seok finished and stepped back to look at him, Dae said, "She wanted me to come here, didn't she?" Helmoni Cha. It was her plan. Ryu Seok looked at his son. "Yes," he said. Dae considered this for a moment. "She never met me," he said, not with sadness, just with the factual weight of it. "No," Ryu Seok said, "but she made sure I was taken care of, from a distance, for years." Dae looked up at him. "She did that for me even though she never saw my face." Ryu Seok said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. Dae nodded slowly, the way children nod when they are processing something that is too large for a simple reaction. Then he turned to the door. "Then I'll stand at the front," he said. "Because she deserves someone who came because of her." They walked out together, and the clan watched. In the language of a family like the Ryu clan, watching is not passive. Watching is assessment. Watching is the process by which power decides what it recognizes and what it refuses. And every eye in that courtyard was engaged in exactly that calculation as Ryu Seok walked to the front with his son beside him. The boy did not look around for approval. He did not perform composure. He simply had it, the way a stone has weight, without effort, without announcement. He stood beside his father through the entire ceremony, through the prayers, through the incense, through the formal addresses delivered by men 3 times his age. And he did not fidget, did not wilt, did not look for his mother in the crowd behind him for reassurance. He stood as though he had always stood there. And one by one, the way recognition moves through a room when it is finally ready to move, slowly, and then all at once, the clan began to see it. Not the foreign element they had feared, not the disruption the council had warned against. An heir, the Ryu jaw, the Ryu stillness. Something in the arrangement of the boy's features and the quality of his presence that reached back through generations with a certainty that no document needed to confirm because it was simply visible, simply there, simply undeniable to anyone willing to look without the filter of their own prejudice. Even the eldest council member, the man of 70 who had spoken most forcefully against Dee in the meeting, stood in the back of the courtyard and watched the boy and said nothing, which, in the context of that man's behavior, was a form of concession. After the funeral, the territory disputes that had been gathering like storm clouds along the Ryu borders began, quietly, without announcement, to settle. The Bayek family had constructed their threat around one assumption, that the Ryu succession was broken, that there was no clear heir, that the dynasty was one well-placed crisis away from fragmentation. They had positioned resources. They had made alliances with smaller families who shared their interest in a divided Ryu territory. They had been patient, methodical, and almost correct. The arrival of Day, acknowledged, legitimized, presented publicly and without apology at the funeral of the clan's most respected elder, dismantled that assumption at its foundation. A divided dynasty is an opportunity. A unified one standing over the grave of its grandmother with an heir at its side is a wall. The back intermediaries went quiet. The smaller alliances they had cultivated began to reconsider. Ryu Seok did not need to make a single threat. The image from the funeral courtyard traveled through the networks, the way all significant images do, carried by people who understood what they had witnessed, and passed it along to people who needed to understand. The wall held. Zola did not move into the compound permanently. That was never the agreement, and more importantly, it was never what she wanted. She had not returned to Seoul to be absorbed into a structure that had once expelled her. She had returned for Day's rights, for his safety, for his inheritance of both names he carried. But she had spent 7 years building herself into something independent and whole, and she was not willing to dismantle that for the comfort of a family that was still, in many ways, learning to deserve what she was offering. She found a house in a quiet district 20 minutes from the compound. Clean lines, good light, a garden that Day immediately claimed as his territory for the keeping of whatever small creatures caught his attention that week. She established her own rhythm, her own work, her own friends, her own version of Seoul that had nothing to do with the Ryu name. What she and Ryu Seok built instead had no clean category in the language of crime families or ordinary families, or any established vocabulary for people who had hurt each other badly and were now trying to navigate the territory on the other side of it. It was not reconciliation. That word implied a return to something, and there was nothing to return to. What they had before had been too brief and too damaged to serve as a foundation for anything. It was not friendship. That word was too simple, too bloodless for the complexity of what they carried between them. It was, perhaps, a working alliance in the service of a person they both loved more than they had ever loved each other. They developed a schedule. Day spent 3 days at the compound, 3 days at Zola's house, and 1 day that belonged entirely to him, to go where he wanted, do what he wanted, be neither Ryu Seok's heir nor Zola's son, but simply a 7-year-old boy in a city that had no idea who he was. On the days when the schedule required them to exchange information or make decisions about Day together, Ryu Seok and Zola met briefly, spoke directly, and maintained the kind of focused courtesy that is harder to sustain than either passion or anger, but serves people far better than either. It was not easy. There were days when Zola looked at Ryu Seok and felt the full weight of what he had done. The envelope on the desk, the words delivered without meeting her eyes, the years she had spent alone with a secret that should never have been hers to carry. On those days she was very quiet, very controlled, and she did not volunteer anything beyond what was necessary. And Ryu Seok, to his credit, had stopped expecting more than that. He had stopped looking for signs of forgiveness in her face. He had accepted, with the same discipline he applied to everything else in his life, that forgiveness was not the metric here. That what mattered was the child, the consistency, the daily accumulation of showing up and being someone Day could rely on. Everything else was his own responsibility to process, privately, without making it Zola's problem. The compound adjusted. It did not become gentle. It did not become something from a different kind of story.
Maybe you're listening to this while doing something simple. Washing dishes, tidying up, trying to relax. And that's exactly why these stories work. When you unlock full access, you get 30 stories. Over 30 hours of audio with no interruptions. You press play, and the story just keeps going. If you want to continue right now, scan the QR code on your SC, or tap the link in the pinned comment. What was never said continues there.
It remained what it was, complicated and dangerous, and governed by rules that ordinary life does not operate by. That did not change and was not going to. But it became, for the first time in its history, honest about what it was built on. Because Day asked questions. Endlessly, persistently. With the particular quality of attention that made it impossible to deflect him with a vague answer, because he would simply wait, quietly with his hands folded, with that expression that his mother had and that his grandfather had had before her, until a real answer arrived. He asked Ryu Seok about the history of the family, about Korea, about why certain rooms were locked and why certain men spoke to his father differently than others. He asked about Hailmoni Cha, what she had been like when she was younger, what she had believed, what she had wanted for the family that the family had not yet managed to become. And Ryu Seok answered him, not everything. Not the parts that were not a child's to carry yet. But more than he had ever answered anyone, more than he had spoken honestly to any person in this compound in years, because Day's questions had the quality of a blade that does not threaten, that simply cuts through to what is real. And Ryu Seok found that he did not want to be less honest than a 7-year-old boy had decided to be. They developed, slowly and without naming it, something that resembled the beginning of a language between them. Evenings in the garden, a standing game of Baduk that Day was genuinely learning, and that Ryu Seok found himself explaining with more patience than he had previously believed he possessed. Small exchanges over meals. The quiet competence with which Day absorbed everything around him, watching, cataloging, understanding, and occasionally producing observations of such precise accuracy that the lieutenants who overheard them would look at each other and say nothing, because there was nothing to say. The boy was extraordinary, not in a performed way, not in a way that required an audience. He was extraordinary the way a river is extraordinary, not because it announces itself, but because of the consistency and inevitability of the direction it moves. He was his mother's son in the way he observed before he spoke, in the way he never needed a room's approval to stand still inside it, in the way his silences were not empty but full of something being processed. He was his father's son in the way he understood, even at 7, that power is not something you perform, that it is something you carry, quietly, until it is needed. He was Hailmoni Cha's legacy in the way he held both of those things at once without letting either cancel the other out. He was perhaps most precisely simply himself, a child who had come into a complicated world and was navigating it with a grace that none of the adults around him had managed to develop without considerable damage first. And the dynasty that had spent generations protecting the purity of its bloodline found itself, in the quiet accumulation of ordinary days, being slowly and irreversibly changed by the person it had tried hardest to exclude. The Ryu name would continue, not as it had been, rigid, closed, self-consuming, but as something with more room in it. More truth, the kind of strength that does not need to break what it cannot control, but learns finally to hold it. Hailmoni Cha used to say that a bloodline is not what flows through the veins. It is what survives the choices made in the dark. Ryu Seok chose wrong once, and then, slowly, painfully, without grace, he chose differently. Not because he became a good man overnight, but because a 7-year-old boy looked at him without fear and made him want to deserve that. Day is still a child. The compound is still a world built on danger. And there are men in that council room who voted against him, who smiled at the funeral, and have not forgotten. So tell me, can a boy born from exile truly inherit a throne built to reject him? And when the time comes for Day to make his own impossible choice, will he carry his mother's wisdom or his father's ruthlessness? 3 months after the funeral, a woman appeared at the compound gates. No announcement, no appointment, no name given to the guards. She carried only one thing, a letter, written in Helmoni Cha's handwriting, dated 6 years before her death. Ryu Seok opened it alone, in the same room where he had once placed an envelope on a desk and ended a marriage without looking up. Inside, in the old woman's careful, deliberate script, was a name. A name that no one in the Ryu compound had spoken aloud in over a decade. A name that belonged to a chapter of the family's history that everyone had agreed, quietly and collectively, to leave buried. Below the name, 4 words. He is not alone. Ryu Seok read it 3 times. Then he folded the letter and placed it in his jacket pocket. He walked to the window that overlooked the garden. Day was outside, sitting cross-legged on the stone path, examining something small and alive with the focused patience that was entirely his own. Unaware, unhurried, safe, for now. And for the first time since the boy had arrived and the dynasty had found its footing again, Ryu Seok felt something he had not felt in years. Not anger, not calculation, fear. The quiet, precise kind.